Right.
Sorry?
Oh. Good evening. Ali, what was your sister's name? Who said in Shmosa? Malka Bas. Shimon Eliezer. Shlomo Eliezer. Should be Nishmas Malka Bas Shlomo Eliezer. Okay. What's like to wish a very, very big mazel tov in case Yehuda gets to hear this. It's not on. Usually is. The Yehuda for his baby boy, to be zeichet to have Gadol Torah Chupam Asim Tevim, Nachnis Lebisra Vamorinu Bitu Bismanoi, Nishav Nachas. Okay. We're up to Chav Tesam with Aleph, about 8 lines from the top, and the whole sugi of today is discussing different foods that you can use for Eiruvin Tchumin. How many meals worth do you have to put out for Eiruvin Tchumin? 2. So the verse is like this. Amar Rava. Rava said, Rashi tells us that Rava made this statement when he was in a very good mood, when his mind was clear. Harini ki ben Azai b'shukei Tiberia. Just like Ben Azai was able to resolve all questions in Shukei Tiberia, so too said Rava on this particular day, he was able to answer any question. Nowadays, most people would be asking him, when's Mashiach coming? And things like that. But he didn't. Somebody came to him and said to him, how many apples do you need to do a Eiruvin Tchumin? So Rava replied, are you even allowed to do a Eiruvin Tchumin with apples? Now this is problematic. Why is it problematic? What's the problem with Rava's statement? What's wrong with Rava's statement? The problem with Rava's statement is, the Rava says, are you allowed to use apples for Eiruvin Tchumin? Why in the world not? We had dates that are not ripe, grain that's still green, and all of that you could use Eiruvin Tchumin for. And apples you can't make it taste not. The mice the more paskins in the end that you are allowed to do Eiruvin Tchumin with apples, not like Rava. But the question is, what was Rava even thinking? Okay, we don't pass the night cover. What was Rava? Say? The Meforshim say what? So the Meforshim say 2 malachim. Some of the Shem V'Tvon Rashba say we're talking about sour apples, crab apples. I think they're called apples which are not so geschmack to eat. Okay, apples which are not geschmack to eat. You can still use it for Tchumin. Others say another very interesting point, and that is like this. Apples are used only for dessert. People don't eat apples during the meal. So therefore, everything else like dates was made to make the bread tastier, like jam to make the bread tastier. So therefore, it was considered part of the meal. Something which is only a dessert, Rava understood that you can't use that for Eiruvin Tchumin. Why? Because something which is part of the meal, like if you talk about, if you imagine dates, or a bit like, for example, nowadays the kugel is, or the green beans are at a meal. But what happens is, it's part of the main course. It is part of the main course. You have usually chicken with kugel, chicken and thing. So it's part of the meal. Imagine somebody would say to you, I'm selling portions of food, a piece of ice cream. That's not a portion of food. The kugel is considered a portion of food. Okay. So what says, no, that's the shayla. The maskana of the more is you can use apples, which means either of those problems we don't agree with. The word says, can you not use apples? We learned in the Mishnah. The Mishnah now discusses 3 aspects regarding food, and the basic rule applies to all 3, which is that you can join different kinds of food. Let's say you need a shiur of food for Eiruvin Tchumin. Can you combine bread and grapes or apples and oranges? Yes, you can. That's the chiddush. And the Mishnah says for 3 different things you can combine different foods to make it. What are the 3 different things? The halacha is, food does not make you tummy by touching it. The reason is, food usually gets to the level of rishon the tumah, and a human being never becomes a sheni the tumah. So therefore, food can never make a person tummy by touching. Yet, if you eat tummy food, No, food doesn't come with that. But if you eat food, then you're not allowed to eat truma. Does anybody know why if you eat tummy food, you can't eat truma? Better, you're right, but why?
The food will touch the tumah.
Because many times people would eat different foods together. So therefore, if you eat tummy food, you might come to eat the truma with it, and then the truma in your mouth will touch the tummy food. So how much do you have to eat as a chatzi pras? Chatzi pras is half, a pras means a half as well. So a quarter of a pras of food, which is about a kibetza. So now, you're allowed to combine, if you, let's say, for example, you have tummy wheat and tummy barley, you eat the two together, it combines to make a person tummy. And different foods combine for an Eruv. For food to make other food tummy, they have to be the size of a kibetza. So therefore, they can combine. The chiddush of the Mishnah is you can combine different foods for three different things. To make a person tummy, to make other foods tummy, and to make for Rubei Tchumen. Says, well, now where do you see from over here that you can use apples? What's the kasha from this Mishnah? Because the Mishnah starts off, all foods can combine. All foods makes it sound, every kind of food can combine, including apples. Apples should also be included. What did Rabbi Yochanan say, if you remember, not that long ago? We never learn from a general rule. Even when the Mishnah says all foods, there can always be an exception to the rule. So therefore, what's the kasha? Rabbi said you can't do Eiruvin with apples. The Gemara says, what do you mean? You've got a Mishnah. What exactly did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah just said you can combine different foods. Oh, it says all foods. It doesn't matter the fact that it says all foods. Rabbi Yochanan says, even when the Mishnah says all foods, there can be exceptions. The kasha of the Gemara is like this. Because the Mishnah says three things together. Like for tumah, for eruv, and for tumah of the person himself. And regarding tumah, obviously apples do spread tumah, because at the end of the day, so if apples can spread tumah, and the Mishnah lists all the foods that spread tumah can combine, and also all the foods can combine for Rubei Tchumen, so obviously the Mishnah was also talking about apples. So therefore we see that you can use apples for Rubei Tchumen. And it can also create tumah. So therefore, if tumah can spread with apples, you can make it with tchum with apples. So either of the two logics which Rava held by, either that they are not pleasant apples, they were bitter apples. Alternatively, that they were only desserts, we don't agree with them, and therefore you can do an eruv tchum with apples. The camel. How many apples do you need? You have to have a kav of tapuchim. A kav. Meisvi. That's the kasha as follows. The Mishnah lists that when you give a poor man, you have to give them a proper gift. Rashi al says it, that you should give b'nosata la'oni la'gev. You also come with the exact lashon of pasuk. Rashi says that when you distribute for the poor people, you have to give as something which is a proper nesina. What? The Mishnah now lists it out. The Brayso lists it out. So Rashi asks the kasha. Yeah, Rashi actually right. Rashi says, what happens if you don't have enough to give to all the poor people? So you put down a sizable portion. You let the poor people decide between themselves who should get it. So the Brayso lists out what's considered a proper portion to give to the poor. Says the Brayso, uchla letavli. For herbs, you're supposed to give a uchla. An uchla is the eighth of a lug. Because spices are very expensive and you don't need a lot of them. So an eighth of a lug of spices is enough. That's considered a gift. Velitra yerek, and a lug of vegetables. V'asoy goes in 10 nuts, v'chamisha farskin and 5 peaches, v'shnei v'moinim or 2 pomegranates v'esegechot. So if a poor man comes to your door, you give him 2 pomegranates or 1 esed, 10 nuts. That's considered a proper gift. V'omar gusuk ba'dori mishmei derav Menashe ba'skuruli mishmei derav. Rav Gusuk said the name of Menashe and the name of Rav b'chein me'eruv. That these measurements, which are good enough for a poor man to be considered a proper gift, is the same measurement for Eiruvin Tchumen. Now, what's the measurements? 5 peaches. 5 peaches is a lot less than a kav of apples. And the Gemara understands in the Havaman at least that there's no difference between peaches and apples. So why in the world should you have to give more apples for Uvei Tchumen than peaches? He says, well, Answer, well, no. Hani chashivi, vani lo chashivi. And the way the Rishonim explain is like this. Peaches, I'm not saying what you eat for supper tonight, but what the Rishonim say. Peaches are eaten as part of the main course. And therefore, for 2 meals, you only need a minimal amount. 5 peaches, you have 2 in one, 3 in another, that's enough. Apples are eaten on their own. So therefore, you have to have a minimum of a kav of apples. That should be a proper shiur, because otherwise, it's not considered a proper portion. Omar Ab Yosef. Now, what happened was like this. There was a brisa giving us a list of portions which you give to a poor man when he comes to the barn and he says to you, I'm a poor, I'm a nice oni. You have to give him a proper portion. You can't give him a small amount. There's also a Mishnah that lists other foods. So here was a list of nuts, pomegranates, esrogim, etc. There's a Mishnah that lists other measurements. Now, Rav said about these measurements, the same halacha applies to Erev Tchumen. Came along Rabbi Yosef and said that the Amora that quoted Rav as saying the same halacha applies to Uvei Tchumen needs to get mechila from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Why? Because he misquoted Rav. Because Rav was not discussing that brisa which talks about those foods. He was talking about a Mishnah which is describing different foods. Obviously, every kind of food is a different portion that you have to give to the poor, as we saw already. For spices, it's only 1/8 of a lug. For nuts, it's 10 whole nuts. So we see that there's different measurements, different foods. When Rav said the same halacha applies to Uvei Tchumen, Rav was talking about the Mishnah, not the brisa. And the fact that he quoted Rav as speaking on the brisa, for that HaKadosh has to forgive him. Omar Yosef, surely more than Menashe b'askruli. That Hashem should forgive Menashe. Why? And I was one who taught it to him. And when I taught it to him, I taught him I'm masnisin. That means imagine you say to somebody a word to somebody, you say, wait, the Brisklov says this word, this Rambam. And then later you have the same person saying the Brisklov saying the word on a different Rambam. You say, well, you're misquoting. I told it to him in the name of Rav that this works for Uvei Tchumen. But I said it to him on the Mishnah. He went and quoted on the brisa. It's not the same kind of halachas. In fact, the Lord's going to ask in a minute, what difference does it make if Rav said it on the Mishnah or the brisa? But this is the Mishnah which is describing the same halachas. And when you want to give a poor man food, you have to give him a proper portion. What's the portion? Ein person only begun mechatzi kav chitin, like you said, Levi Yitzchok. You have to give him half a kav of wheat, the kav se'ovid, and a whole kav of barley. Barley is less geschmack, it's less quality foods. You have to give him a whole kav. Mechatzi kav saying half a kav. Shows guess what's the machlokas Shlomo and the Chachamim as to whether you have to give what's considered a poor man's meal or a normal man's meal. Okay. The kav b'chatzi kusmin. Spelt, you have to give him 1.5 kav. Spelt is even less good quality than barley. The kav grogros. If you want to give him dried figs, you have to give him a whole kav. Or mona devela, or a fig cake, you have to give him the weight of a mona. And we give him a pras, half a mona of a cake, a fig cake. The chatzi lug yain, half a lug of wine. How much is half a lug berach? Like 2 of our bechers. So if you want to give a poor man knocks on the door, you have to give him 2 bechers worth of wine. Give him a revius 1 becher. The revius shemen 1 cup of oil. And we give him a shminis, half a cup of oil. Oil is even more precious. The shakal appears. What about oranges, tangerines? What about those? Enough that he can sell and buy with the money 2 meals. Okay, the Mishnah gives a long list of different foods that if a poor man comes to your door, that is the portion that you have to give him. I know, it's interesting. For example, spelt nowadays costs a lot more than wheat. Yeah, buy spelt bread because okay, I don't know. That's what it was.
Much rarer.
It seems so.
Yeah, saying gold, silver's going to go over the price of gold. In those days,
okay.
Best, barley after that.
So now on that, and Rav said the same halacha applies to Uvei Tchumen. That means when Rav said these measurements apply for Uvei Tchumen, he was going on the Mishnah, not on the brisa. What difference does it make if Rav was speaking on the Mishnah on the brisa? They're both saying measurements give to the poor, and both you could say the same svod. If it's a good enough portion to give to a poor man, then it's a good enough portion to make a Uvei Tchumen with it. If you say, you know what he was upset about Abu Yosef? is that the first one, the Brisa, mentions spices. Spices can't be eaten on their own. And when he finished off and said that Rav said that works for Ruvei Tchumin, so you were saying an incorrect halacha. Because Rav couldn't possibly say you're allowed to use them for Ruvei Tchumin. Why not? Because you can't eat them. Wheat and barley you also can't eat on their own. You can't eat raw wheat or raw barley. So therefore, Rav also, when he said, and the Rishonim explained, so when Rav said, "V'chein le ruvei tchumin," what did Rav mean? Those which are edible would be good enough for ruvei tchumin. But something which is not edible, of course, Rav was never talking about. So therefore, you can't complain that in the first one it discusses something which is inedible, because the second also talks about something inedible. Rav was one who said, you need to have 2 reviers of wine, which is 2 bechets. Rav was one who wanted to teach us that for an Eruv of wine, you have to have 2 bechets. And since Rav thought that halacha was important, where would he have got that halacha from? From the Mishnah, from the Brisa. The Brisa doesn't mention wine. So when Rav said, you're right, that halachically, there is no difference if Rav spoke on the Brisa on the Mishnah. But since Rav wanted to set the halacha correct, that for an Eruv Tchumin you need to have 2 cups of wine, Rav obviously spoke on the Mishnah and he never spoke on the Brisa. And therefore, when you quoted him of Skuv, what was his name? Of Menashe Bar Seguvli, mentioned it on the Brisa, he was doing a disfavor, an incorrect quotation, and therefore Hashem should forgive him for quoting it on the Brisa. Okay.
You can't use the stomach.
You can't use something which isn't edible. Yes, something which can't eat by itself, which can't be eaten, can't be used. You can combine 2 foods. Let's say, for example, you want to make Ruvei Tchumin. So you take an apple and an orange and a banana. Use that Ruvei Tchumin. As long as it's enough for 2 meals, it's okay. So Rav Yosef held, logically, you have to have a meal from each. A meal of apples, a meal of oranges, a meal of wheat, a meal of barley. But you can't have half a meal of wheat, plus another half of barley, plus another half a meal of bananas and half a meal of apples. Each meal has to be at least 1 kind of food. You can even have half, a third, or a quarter of a meal from 1 food. So you can have many different kinds of food, as long as combined together, it comes to Ruvei Tchumin. You have to have 2 reviers of wine. Furthermore, you need so much wine. With 2 reviers of wine is about 300 milliliters of wine. You need so much. But let's remember, this is quite tricky. Big difference. Boy is to eat with it. Is to eat of it. Boy means like this. I want to eat bread. I want to make that bread tasty. So I want to eat with it wine. How much wine do you have to have? A very little bit. You dip your bread in wine and you eat the bread. Mimenu is to eat from it, meaning you have to how much wine you need to be able to drink from it. So when the Brisa says how much wine do you need to have, that's enough wine that if you dip your bread inside, your bread will be tasty. That's a lot less than 2 cups of wine. Similarly by vinegar, sorry, to dip in it. Vinegar enough to dip. If you've got a bit of chvein, as long as you've got enough to dip. To eat of them, and again, Rashi says to eat with them 2 meals. What does it mean to eat with them 2 meals? That you're having bread and you have onions or olives to make your bread tastier. That's how much olives and onions you need. So in Ma'aseh we've got a stira. Rav told us how much wine do you need? 2 cups, 2 of these. The Brisa says enough to dip your bread in, which is a lot less. There it's with cooked wine. Cooked wine, what happens is people dip. Normal wine, people drink. So if it's normal wine that you drink, you have to have enough to be able to drink 2 meals. If it's wine which is cooked, it's like a condiment, then it's enough to dip. Enough to dip. To dip 2 meals of vegetables. Imagine a person wants to eat a meal of vegetables. On a diet, I don't know, he wants to be healthy. A whole meal of vegetables. So what he does is he has to have enough vinegar to dip an entire meal of vegetables. It could be much bigger color. The amount of vegetables which are eaten in a normal meal. Let's say you're having a normal meal. and you have with the meal a couple of vegetables to add to the food, so you need to have enough vinegar to dip inside it the vegetables that are eaten with 2 meals. That's a lot less. The first lashon is 2 meals worth of vegetables. Right? The second lashon is 2 meals which have vegetables included. So it's a tiny amount of vinegar. And we pass in the kula, by the way. Says the Gemara, Omar zeisimu b'tzolim, olives and onions, k'derechor ben mozen shtei sudos. Enough that you can eat 2 meals. And as we explained, doesn't mean that you're going to have enough onions to fill yourself up. It means enough onions that will make your bread taste nice. Says Bob, can you do an Eruv tchumin with onions? Well, Tanya Meir spent a Shabbos in a place called Diska. And a person came to him and said to him, he lived in one town. He wanted to get to another town called Tivin, and he put the onions halfway. And he came to him on Shabbos, and as Tosis, the bottom Tosis points out, that we're talking about where he met him out of the town. Where Yomi said you can't move for the rest of Shabbos more than 4 hours. Why? Let's work it out. Let's imagine he was in Manchester. He wants to get to a place called Tivin, which is 4,000 amos away from Manchester. So he put onions 2,000 amos away. And he walked 2,500 amos towards Tivin. And then he meets Meir. And he says to Meir, I'm walking more than 2,000 amos, but it's not a problem. I made Eruv Tchumen. What did you use for Eruv Tchumen? Onions. Onions. Stay where you are for the rest of Shabbos. You can't move. Why? Had he been in a town, you could have moved around the whole town. But since he was not in the town, so he's only allowed to go, if you go out of your tchum, you're only allowed 4 amos. That's the halach. Chashva first walks out of the tchum, he's only allowed to walk 4 amos and no more. So for what happened was, a person, there's a beautiful story in Voices in the Silence, a beautiful story that the chassan, was by mistake, that means her father, Basia, what was she called? Maislik's father, was when the Shabbos of the Oifuf, by mistake got out of the Tchum. He was traveling with a goy, and the goy refused to stop for him. So what happened was, he was literally not far from the Kala's house, but he couldn't walk to Kala's house because he came out of the Tchum. He told the goy, go to my Kala's house, tell them that I'm coming, and I'll give you money after Shabbos. The goy didn't believe that he would fulfill it, so he said, I will. But they ran away and never did it. The whole Shabbos they spent worried, where's the chosser about the Shabbos Oifuf? After Shabbos, they found out where he was. Once you come out of your tchum, you can't walk. So Meir said to him, you've got to stay where you are. Now, why do you say to him you have to stay where you are? Because onions can't be used for all tchumin. Well, that story, he obviously thought he can wait it out. And what's the Shabbos? Maybe he arrived at Shabbos morning. Says about like, if it's Pekach Nefesh, it's not a Shaila. Lo Kasha. These Russian people read their stories, they were very tough. They coped with it. That was with the coat they left on the tree, yes. Steinberg. Lo Kasha says, the leaves of onions are dangerous, the onions themselves are healthy. The Tanya Ocha Botz, if a person eats onions, the Hishkabul Mason, he dies. Ain't no even my mace. You don't need to inquire why he died. Why? Because he definitely died because of the onions.
Why would I have thought you can use leaves of onions?
That's he thought that it's okay. The actual bulbs are okay, just the leaves. The leaves as well, we never said Ella, top of decimal base. Where the leaves haven't reached the size of a zeros. What's the size of a zeros? From your thumb to your little finger when it's stretched, this is the size of a zeros. Once the leaves are the size of a zeros, onion leaves are the size of a zeros, they're not so dangerous. They don't cause danger. If you drink beer, it counteracts the danger of the onion leaves, and you can eat the onion leaves and afterwards have beer. It's got a snake, and Rashi explains, I mean literally a snake, it means it's got a poison, it's got a sharpness like a snake. It was. He ate half an onion with half its poison. That's the leaves of the onion. The world needed him. So you have to be very careful not to eat the leaves of onions. Right. What's the word for it? I mean, the Chadadol says that inside the onion leaves, it twists and turns until you actually have, in an onion leaf, it looks like a snake, and that part which looks like a snake is actually poisonous. Okay. So we're finished now with the onions. So how many onions? So again, so onions, can you do a Eiruvin Tchumah with onions? Yeah, but not with the leaves of onions. Okay.
These were smaller than the zers.
Oh, well, obviously leaves here. Leaves it. Amar b'zeh amar shmo. Sheichal beer ma'avin boy. You can do an Eruv Tchumah with beer. And if you pour 3 lug into a mikveh, it passes. The halacha is that a mikveh which has 40 sa'ah, you can pour in it all the water in the world, it will not become possible. If it does not have 40 sa'ah, and you pour into it 3 lug, the entire mikveh is possible, even though it's bottom, below, etc. The entire mikveh is possible. I was once with Zev Lef, I told you the story once before maybe, and the lady called about the lady charged mikveh, terrified that what happened was that added the water of the mikveh before drying it out. And she was concerned that there would be 3 lug of water, moisture in the walls of the mikveh. Normally they dry it out, then they add the water. This time they hadn't. And he said to you, don't need to worry because moisture can never be 3 lug. Okay, you have to know the size of the mikveh, and you must have known the dry. But you have to be careful not to have 3 lug. Now only water passes. But for example, something which is not water does not pass. The more Maccas discuss a little bit what things are not water, etc. So over here it says that beer passes mikveh. So if you've got a mikveh which hasn't got 40 sa'ah, and you pour inside it 3 lug, how much is a lug? Approximately half a liter. 4 cups. So approximately, no, so it's approximately half a liter. So 1.5 liters of beer into a mikveh which hasn't got 40 sa'ah, then everything is possible. You'd have to start the whole thing from scratch. What is he trying to teach me? What's the difference between beer and colored water? The time we say if you've got colored water, it passes the mikveh. If you look, there is called colored water. That means colored water is called water. So therefore, it passes the mikveh. Beer, you might have thought it's not considered water. It's a new, completely new creation, and therefore it shouldn't pass to the mikveh. No, beer is considered like water, and it passes the mikveh. How much beer do you need to have? You have to have 2 reviers of. No, not 2 reviers. I'm sorry, 2 lug of beer. Over here, when we say rivi, we mean a quarter of a cab. A quarter of a cab is a lug. Normally, when we say a quarter, we mean a quarter of a lug, which is a reviers. Here, we talk about a quarter of a cab, which is a lug, and he says 2 quarters. It's 2 lug, and he says a fascinating cheshbon. How much wine does anybody remember? Do you need to carry on Shabbos to be chayav chatos? Does anybody remember? Okay, how much beer do you have to carry on Shabbos to be chayav chatos? Anybody remember? What is Hakayim? We had it, we learned it. How much beer or how much wine do you need to carry on Shabbos? If you remember, we had lists and lists of food, and there has to be a significant amount. If it's not a significant amount, if you take, no, very close. By most liquids, it's revis. By wine, most people would dilute the wine 3/4 to a quarter. So if you took a quarter of a revis of wine, it would be enough to be chayav, because you could add later 3/4 of water. So, but other liquids is how much is a revis. So wine is how many times more important than beer? 4. It's 4 times more important. Now, how much wine do you need to be chayav to fulfill Eiruvin Tchumah? Does anybody remember? We had it a few minutes ago. How much did Rav say? How much? 2 revis. 4 times as much is 2 lug. So he said like this. Since we see regarding Hotzon Shabbos that beer to wine is 4 times less valuable, and therefore, if you want to, if the Chashva person doesn't want to, if a person carries a revius of beer is chayav chatos. If he carries a quarter of revius of wine is chayav chatos. Similarly for Eiruvin Tchumah, that 2 cups of wine are needed to be considered a meal. So 2 lug, which is 4 times as much, will be enough to be for Eiruvin Tchumah. So it goes like this. Let's say inside. 2 quarts, that's 2 lug of beer. Because it's not. If you take out wine, enough to make a cup when it's diluted. A good cup. We're talking about a cup of benching. That you should have a quarter of a revius of wine and then afterwards add 3/4 water. Any wine which is not diluted 3 times by water is not good wine, because if it's too strong, it's also no good. So when you get wine, you have to dilute it by 3 times as much. The Ketani Sefer, and that Mishnah carries on Mashakula Mashkin, the revis, all other liquids. How much do you have to have? A revis. All liquids which you want to discard, a revis. Midahasam, if by Hilchas Shabbos, Al Chadarba is 1 to 4, or Chadami Al Chadarba. Says, well, you're wrong. Your calculation is wrong. That means to decide that Uveit Chumin by beer has to be 2 lug, because of the fact that by carrying on Shabbos it's 4 times as much, is incorrect. Possum, who there, the bottom less than a quarter, less than a beer, so beer is not choshev. But here it's not true. Sometimes a person will drink a cup of beer in the morning and a cup of beer in the afternoon, and that will be his meal. Can you imagine? Somebody will drink a cup of beer and he'll be satisfied.
So it's going to the 3 going all the way.
Yeah.
If according to this question,
Right.
really,
That's it.
So according to this question, really, wine is more kosher than beer. How is
Maybe the Gemara, I hear it's an interesting question, but maybe the Gemara understood that for passing mikveh it makes no difference. It's the quality, it's the quantity of the volume. So wine, because it changes the color.
You change the color. You call it good diluted wine,
not colored water. Yeah. It's good to have. I just say very briefly is that the Taz was fired from his job. Can you imagine the Taz wrote on all 4 sets of Shulchan Aruch. Why was he fired from his job? Because he was very, 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 very poor. He used to be starving. And one night, it was like 3 a.m, he was so hungry he couldn't learn. So what happened was he looked for a shop to eat something. The only shop he could find was a tavern. So he went inside, he couldn't afford, he asked, can he buy on credit a cup of alcohol, just to give him energy to carry on learning. And the person wrote it down that the Taz owes. And so one of the people in the killer saw that the Taz owes for buying alcohol in the middle of the night. And he's spread rumors about him. He had him fired from his job.
Another one that a Shabbos Friday night, the candle went out. And then they saw the lights got off, so they were like, well, why
why not learning? Yeah. So okay. So Gemara says that how much beer do you need to do Eiruvin Chumin? 2 cups of beer. That's how much you need. Says the Lord, Tmoim Bekama. How much dates do you need to do Eiruvin Chumin? Omav Yosef Tmoim Bekav. You have to have a kav. Omav Yosef V'noam Minalo. How do I know this? The Tanya. The halacha is that if a person eats Truma B'Shoigig, what does he pay back? Anybody know? If you eat Truma B'Shoigig, what? 1 plus a bit. But what does he pay back? 1 plus a fifth. What does he pay back? He has to pay back fruit. You can't pay back cash. It has to be something that can be turned into Truma. So the Gemara says like this. How do I know that Tmoim is a kav? The Tanya, Ochal Gurgus, if you ate figs, the Shivim Tmoim, and you pay back with dates, Tobalo Bocha, you'll get a Bocha from Hashem. What's the case? Even if you domin, we're talking according to the value. I steal by mistake from a kohen. I didn't realize it was his. I didn't realize it was Truma. And I ate a kav of figs. And I evaluated 5 pounds. So I give him back 5 pounds worth of dates. So my vocha, which vocha should he get? You've not given back anything worth more. If you gave back something worth more, you could say, wow, thank you. But here, if you go according to the value, you haven't given back anything more. Elalav. Elalav, if you middle. Wait a second, I've lost the back to the vocha. Zuzah ocha, zuzah kamashal. You ate a zuz, you're paying a zuz. Elalav, if you middle. We're talking about according to measure. He took a measure of figs. The Shavya Zuzah, which is worth 1 zuz. The Komishanim Guya, the Tamarim, the same measure he paid back in dates. The Shavya Abo, which is worth 4 times as much. So now we can understand the Ketani Tavalah Bocha, Al Metzbah Madifi. So we see anyway from this price, so if you work it out, the only way to understand Tavalah Bocha is not that it's by value, it must be by volume. Because it's by value, you've not actually paid back anymore. So it must be by volume. If it's by volume, so we see that paying back dates is worth more than figs. So what's better? Dates. So we see that dates are better. And before we saw that figs by a poor man. How much figs do you have to give a poor man? It says a calf. And Rav said on that, in the name of that for a poor man, you want to give him a portion, what should you give him? You give him a calf of figs. And Rav said the same thing regarding a Ruvei Tchumen. And now we know that dates are worth more than figs. So therefore you can be sure that giving a calf of dates is better. We're talking about he took his zuz worth, he paid back his zuz worth, and you've got no right that dates are worth more. That he paid him back with something which is easy to sell. In those days, I don't know how much it is nowadays, I always bother going to it, but to our idis, boys, there's certain things which cost exactly the same price, but one of them is easy to sell and one is hard to sell. And therefore, it could very well, that means normally the problem with it is if something is easy to sell, that means a lot of buyers want it and the price automatically goes up because of it. But sometimes you have such a thing as the same property, both cost the same, but it's just easier to sell. So therefore, you give it back to the kohen, something which you can sell easier. Says the Gemara now, more measurements of a Ruvei Tchumen. Shesisa. Shesisa is made out of dried grain, which you add honey. Shagushi, 2 spoons. Can you imagine 2 spoons of shesisa is enough for Ruvei Tchumen. Kisinoi, which is parched grain. Omar Abai Trei Buni, 2 measures to pumpatisa. It's 2 very small measurements which they used to use to pumpatisa. Since we mentioned parched grain, we talk a little bit about parched grain. Omar Abai, Omri Aim. My nursemaid, my mother told me, because he never saw his mother, so it was one who brought him up. Hani Kasoni, these parched grain, Malu and Libba, make the heart feel better, and get rid of worries. Eating parched grain makes a person worry less. And even nowadays, they say that certain foods can actually calm a person. My mother said to me, person's got a weak heart. You should take meat of the right thigh of a ram, and he should take dung, which was relieved in the month of Nisan. That means dung, which was the animal, relieved itself in the month of Nisan. If he hasn't got that, he should take twigs from an arava tree. He should use either the dung or the twigs to make a fire. He should eat that meat which comes to the right side of the ram. He should drink afterwards diluted wine, and he'll feel better. Yeah, that's right. They used to use it to burn the fire. That is dung burns what?
So it's not specially done, it's everything that burns well.
He says bashba dafkados. Anything which is a dip. It's enough to eat with it. So, lifton is a dip or a condiment. Anything which is a condiment has enough bread that you can eat with it. So let's say, for example, it's a small amount of food, but with it, it's enough to eat the bread, that's enough. Anything which is not a lifton, to eat from it, as we said before, it's a very big difference. Lechel bo is much less. Lechel bo is like chrein. You eat with it, you're not going to eat that as the main dish. But something which is not lifton, it's the main food, enough to eat from it, 2 meals. So now we've got to examine each food. Is it something which is eaten as an addition to bread, or is it eaten by itself? So bosa chai, raw meat, everybody eats by itself. You don't use raw meat as a dip. Bosa tzli, roast meat, people use it to add to the bread. To eat from it. How do I know that roasted meat people eat by itself and they don't eat it with bread? So the Persians, they eat pieces of roasted meat without bread. So we see that roasted meat is not an addition to the bread, but rather roasted meat is the main meal. Do we go after the Persians? Halacha is for a piece of clothing to become tomei, it has to be of value. What's the size? Anybody remember? Very good. 3 by 3 fingers. But that's for the poor. What about the rich? 3 by 3 tvachim. We said 3 by 3 tvachim. So now it says like this. Big day anim, lanim, close of anim, which is 3 by 3 fingers, lanim. Big day ashirim has to be 3 by 3 tvachim, la ashir makes it ashir. So if I have, let's say, a wealthy person, multimillionaire, and I get a piece of clothing which is only 3 fingers by 3 fingers, and then it's tmei mace, and I touch it, will I make it tummy? No. But I leave it around, and I give it as a gift to a poor man. And the poor man picks it up. I say something like Bill Gates. There's a poor man, right? Never had the opportunity to learn a daf. So he picks it up. So by him, since he's poor, says therefore it becomes tummy, because by him it's choshev. I have a big day, a wealthy person's clothes for poor, meaning for a poor man doesn't need the size of a big day ashir. So we see that you go after each individual, and therefore, since the Persians ate meat by itself, doesn't affect the rest of the world. And therefore, why should it be that I have to do a ruvei tchumin by somebody of financial status is whether that's right. Exactly. Same piece of cloth. So we see it goes to the person. So what do we care about the Persians? We should care about the people themselves. Always machme. That means we say by tumah we'll machme always make a tummy, and by uvei tchumin we say let's be machme. And therefore, since the Persians they themselves would eat the meat without bread, for uvei tchumin, what's a chumah? To have enough to eat with bread or without bread? For uvei tchumin, what's a chumah? Without bread, because then you have to have a proper piece of meat. So let's say we're being machme. For time we're not machme. If you've got a person who's old or a person who's not well, you only have to give him 2 meals of his eating. So that's a person who's ill eats much less. So you only have to give 2 meals of his. What about somebody who's a big fresser? So we see we're making a gabi uvei tchumin. Somebody who's a big eater, we go according to the average eater. Somebody who's a bad eater, let's say he's old or he's ill, we go according to him. So we see we got the uvei tchumin always mekel. So how can you say by meat we should be machme, we should be mekel? Kasha, it's a kasha. Because of that, we're doing paskan, like of Yosef, and therefore roasted meat, you only need to have enough to eat with bread. You don't need to have enough on its own. That's how much you have to have enough to eat with bread. And that's why I like the idea of the jar of jam. Because the jar of jam, nobody eats. Nobody eats jar of jam by itself. You only eat it with bread. So therefore, it is good enough. It's very good for portion. You heard the Mazel Tov, by the way. At the beginning of the Shiur, I mentioned you as a Mazel Tov. You should look on YouTube if ever gets there. A big Mazel Tov for everybody here in the Shiur. And nice to see you, David, Ben. I hope you're all okay. And Andrew, I hope you're all right. Is everybody okay? It's luck with everything.
Yeah. All fine.
Oh, nice to see you. Oh, how's it going? It's okay. Atzlacha. Ben had a baby boy. There you go. Okay, Atzlacha. Good night. See you.
See you.
Good night.